He'll report back to President Trump what he's seen, and then we'll see what President Trump has to say. President Trump is sort of nothing if not unpredictable, but in a sense, it's sort of encouraging that he's seen these scenes for himself, and he's called it, and he's called it starvation. And I think just doing that puts a certain amount of pressure on Netanyahu to finally come up with a humanitarian plan.
The US President's special envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, will visit the Gaza Strip tomorrow. The story's on the front page of Friday's Times. He's going to develop a new aid distribution plan after spending today with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Here's Caroline Levitt, the White House press secretary, speaking earlier.
Tomorrow, Special Envoy Witkoff and Ambassador Huckabee will be traveling into Gaza to inspect the current distribution sites and secure a plan to deliver more food and meet with local Gazans to hear firsthand about this dire situation on the ground. The Special Envoy and the Ambassador will brief the President immediately after their visit to approve a final plan for food and aid distribution into the region.
Well, that was Caroline Levitt, the White House press secretary. And this visit comes as Israel has come under pressure to end its war in Gaza, with allied countries recognising the state of Palestine. They plan to do so in September if certain conditions are met. And those countries include the UK, France and Canada, among others. And there are currently 140 different countries who have recognised Palestine as a state. Of course, members of the government have privately conceded that pressure on Israel may have little direct impact, but may force the hand of the states, which could bring Israel or get Israel to change course. Well, let's speak in that context to Ambassador Michael Ratney, who was the US ambassador to Saudi Arabia during the Biden administration and previously Consul General in Jerusalem in the Obama administration. Ambassador, what do you think's taking shape here? We've got all this pressure from a number of countries, including G7 states, pressure to recognise, and also we've got the envoy in Israel at the moment and going across to Gaza. What do you think's emerging from all this?
I mean, I think it's all a response to just an extraordinary amount of frustration at where we are in this Gaza conflict after nearly 2 years. I think the decisions by European governments to recognize Palestine as a state, well, it doesn't really change the situation on the ground for Palestinians. It doesn't create an actual state. It is an expression of their political frustration at the slow pace of progress, at the inability of anybody really at this point to bring an end to the war. I think from the U.S. perspective, you have Donald Trump just a few days ago commenting on what he saw, those scenes of misery, those horrific scenes out of Gaza. And he called it as he saw it. He said it was starvation. And he asked his special envoy to go to Israel, where he was today, plans to actually visit Gaza tomorrow, albeit in sort of an Israeli security envelope, and see for himself. You know, I suppose I'm glad that they announced a new humanitarian aid initiative or program. But honestly, I think these programs, that's not what's lacking. What's lacking is the political will and the willingness on the part of the Israelis to allow humanitarian assistance into Gaza in the first place.
And given how reluctant President Trump has been to criticize Prime Minister Netanyahu, how much room for maneuver do you think his envoy, Steve Witkoff, has? I mean, he met Netanyahu today. He's going to go across into Gaza tomorrow. If he sees starvation, how free will he be to say it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. You know, on the one hand, President Trump hasn't, withheld weapons shipments from the Israelis. He hasn't denied them any sort of support in a practical sense, but he hasn't given Netanyahu the sort of full-throated political support for what he seemingly is trying to accomplish in Gaza that I think Netanyahu would like. He's made some pretty blunt statements about where he thinks things stand, his desire to see this war ended, for the Israelis to wrap it up, to find a humanitarian solution. You know, whether Witkoff is not somebody that I've seen making kind of particularly dramatic statements when he's been in front of the press, but he'll certainly go back to Washington. He'll report back to President Trump what he's seen, and then we'll see what President Trump has to say. President Trump is sort of nothing if not unpredictable, but in a sense, it's sort of encouraging that he's seen these scenes for himself, and he's called it starvation. And I think just doing that puts a certain amount of pressure on Netanyahu to finally come up with a humanitarian plan.
Mhm. What do you think happens between now and September? September, let's say it's about 22nd, 23rd at the UN General Assembly, because Israel clearly is not going to want the likes of Britain, France, and Canada to stand on that podium in the General Assembly before the eyes of the world and declare support for a Palestinian state. So, what do you think happens between now and then?
I think probably not much, actually. I mean, I understand the frustration on the part of the UK and France and Canada and others, and their sort of absence of concrete measures they can do to move the ball forward. And that's why they're moving ahead, or seemingly moving ahead, with a decision to recognize Palestine. I'm sure the Israelis will be highly critical of it. Washington might be highly critical of it, although, frankly, when Macron announced that France would recognize Palestine, Trump sort of just shrugged and said it doesn't really change anything. I don't know that you're going to see a massive change in the political situation between now and September. And I don't know that the threat of recognizing Palestine is really going to change Israel's political calculus.
What about the threat of sanctions? I mean, individual ministers from the extreme right have faced sanctions, but what about a broader package? Would the likes of Britain, France, Germany, great allies, strong allies over the decades, go that far?
You know, I think you'll see threats of that. I think you'll see certainly threats from national parliaments and individuals. I have my doubts that the governments will take a decision to sanction in any sort of full-throated way beyond individual members of the Israeli Knesset.
And what about the New York Declaration made? I mean, we had that summit in New York a couple of days ago, the French and then particularly Arab countries, calling on Hamas to essentially disarm, disengage, and leave. Essentially, what about that pressure? What will it take for Hamas to recognize they've been defeated by Israel, the writing's on the wall, and if they want their people to stop suffering, and they want any sense of a Palestinian state, we know that the fundamentalists don't believe in a two-state solution, they have to go.
So the statement was actually remarkable. I think I wish it would have come out a year and a half ago, closer to the beginning of this conflict, when it was pretty clear that, you know, whatever you want to say about Israel, fine. But the fact of the matter is Hamas is the one that started this war on October 7th. And Arab governments in particular were reluctant to criticize them directly. So this took over a year and a half, and it was a rather blunt statement, and I'm glad it finally came. Again, you know, people are frustrated with Israel for sure. I think in many ways, people should be equally frustrated with Hamas. Hamas has been an extraordinarily difficult party in these negotiations, and they have clearly prioritized their political survival and their military survival over the humanitarian situation for the Gazan people. Over and over and over again, they had an opportunity to end the war. The war would have ended if they had released the hostages. It's that simple. But over and over again, they have refused to do that. And as a result, the situation has gotten dire at this point. And clearly, I'm not kind of absolving Israel of responsibility for this, but I think it is worth reminding people that Hamas bears an extraordinary amount of responsibility for what's happened.
Hamas does, but what about the accusation that Israel has engaged in collective punishment? Just looking at the front page of The Guardian for Friday and the headline, and there's a picture of a starving child. The headline is "The Mathematics of Starvation, How Israel Caused a Famine in Gaza." And it says here that Israel knows exactly how much aid is required and how much aid has gone in. And it's got a graph here showing March and April, no food aid entered Gaza. Then May, 19,153, 32% of minimum required allowed in, and it breaks it down very systematically, saying this appears to have been deliberate policy. How strong, how robust an accusation do you think that is?
I mean, it's a serious accusation, and you just have to look at the pictures of starving Gazan children to know how serious it is. What it constitutes in legal terms, I couldn't tell you. But I think the fact of the matter is you're seeing the criticism of Israel ramping up considerably because of those images and because of a desperate desire just to end the war and to get more aid in. You're right. Israel knows how much aid is going in. There's been plan after plan. There's the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. There's airlifts and humanitarian aid currently being dropped by parachute. The fact of the matter is the Gazan people need far more aid than they're getting now, not only to stave off a famine, starvation of these children and the Gazan people, but to get Gaza back to a situation where they have a decent future in front of them.
Okay, Ambassador Michael Ratney, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Times Radio.